One man saved Resident Evil 4 from absolute disaster, and perhaps Resident Evil as a whole, and that man was Shinji Mikami. In desperation, he made a choice that changed Resident Evil forever. Now this begs the question, how did Resident Evil get itself so screwed up that it had to be saved in the first place? And who is this guy, and how did he save such a substantial franchise? In the annals of video game history, few names carry as much weight as Shinji Mikami. From his early days as a designer to his pivotal role in revolutionizing the survival horror genre, Mikami's impact on gaming is immeasurable. This man, after all, created the original Resident Evil. But perhaps his greatest legacy lies in the tale of one game, Resident Evil 4. The development of Resident Evil 4 was plagued with trouble, or maybe hiccups is a better word. I could elaborate on this in, maybe another video, but to understand how Mikami saved Resident Evil 4 and to have some context, all you really need to know is that Resident Evil 1 and Resident Evil 2 were incredibly well met, and Resident Evil 3 wasn't a slouch either. On top of this, Resident Evil Remake for the GameCube was universally praised. With this sort of pedigree, it becomes difficult to top the last thing. So the pressure for Resident Evil 4 was incredibly high, and the popularity of Resident Evil was beginning to wane. Resident Evil 0, as neat as it might be, wasn't as excitedly received. People felt that the formula was growing stale. Resident Evil video game sales, despite critical reception of the remake being amazing, had been in steady decline since Resident Evil 2. During the development of Resident Evil 4, Zero and Remake failed to combine to meet half of the number of sold copies of Resident Evil 2. That's pretty crazy. This, of course, didn't bode well for the series. And, of course, this might have had something to do with Nintendo having control of Resident Evil on the GameCube for a good bit.
You would have fit nicely into a sandwich.
Really?
The GameCube, the system that Resident Evil games were focused on at the time, that Mikami had chosen to focus on, failed to catch the popularity of the PlayStation 2, eventually coming in third place in that console generation behind both Microsoft and Sony. When less people have a system that your games are on, you can only sell so many games. That's just the way it works.
Awesome. This is video game heaven.
All of this combined to create quite the quagmire for Capcom's survival horror franchise. Mikami sure loved Nintendo though, so he was certainly encouraged to make the relationship work, but things were certainly not easy at this point. Mikami announced what he thought would be Resident Evil 4. This was a time of lengthy development because the team was having to sort of create new ideas to fit the new mold of a new console generation. With this new hardware and the waning popularity of Resident Evil's formula in mind, Mikami considered a game where the hero would be incredibly strong and incredibly cool. With the power that this new hardware would pack, and in an attempt to circumvent expectations for the franchise, Mikami settled on an action-style game. The hero of the game, as mentioned, would be super powerful, and Mikami sought to explain this by biotechnology, which would make sense in the Resident Evil and Biohazard world. They tried to make the cool character work for the world of Resident Evil, but it wasn't working. Mikami did want something fresh, but he felt that what they had come up with was straying too far from the Resident Evil franchise, which was based around tense situations. Well, I mean, it's survival horror. The game that Mikami had been planning was suddenly changed. That game instead became Devil May Cry for the PlayStation 2. Released in 2001. While Devil May Cry went on to start a franchise itself and become super popular and incredibly successful, this brought the development for what was being considered Resident Evil 4 back to square one. Let us remember, Resident Evil 2, again, was a huge commercial success, and naturally Capcom would want to capitalize on this with some sequels. But, as one might imagine, when it comes to this sort of success, you want something extremely similar. If you can make a product that is similar, relatively cheap, and relatively quickly done, it's a recipe for financial security.
Please try and keep me amused, and do not disappoint me by dying too soon. I so want to enjoy this.
but it's not always a recipe for critical acclaim. The games that followed, Resident Evil Code Veronica, Resident Evil 3, Resident Evil 0, and Resident Evil Remake, were all pretty similar to the design of Part 2, and while they were successful in their own right, and very fun, particularly Code Veronica, they certainly emphasized the idea that something needed to change. This was because the public was voting with their wallets, and those votes count. Resident Evil 4 restarted development at the end of 2001. The new game, announced as part of the Resident Evil lineup for GameCube, was directed by Hiroshi Shibata, who was part of the development team for Resident Evil 3. In a trailer that fans have dubbed the Fog trailer, we get an inkling of what Resident Evil could have been. In this, we see some words alluding to the beginnings of the virus from Resident Evil, and Leon Kennedy struggling against some sort of fog monster that seems to be impervious to his weapons. Eventually, the fog takes over him and he is clearly pained. Admittedly, this looks pretty awesome. This ends with the numbers 2000 and X, suggesting that the release date will be anytime soon, and totally not a Mega Man crossover, unfortunately. This game obviously had some of the influence from the research and development of Devil May Cry, because we still had the castles and we still had the gothic style that was seen in Devil May Cry. Mikami, however, noted that his involvement in this project was minimal, with, again, Shibata at the helm. And with this trailer and announcement, news of Resident Evil 4 went quiet for months. During E3 the following year, fans got another trailer during Nintendo's panel. This trailer was short, but then included a message from Mikami himself. In the message, he stated that the rumor behind him being fired was false. This had come from the internet, suggesting that slumped sales and reception of his recent game, PNO3, had caused Capcom to call for his dismissal. But again, he shut those rumors down with this announcement. He also stated that he had been incredibly busy working on Resident Evil 4. He suggested that Resident Evil 4 would be scarier than ever and encouraged viewers not to pee their pants.
Don't pee your pants.
If peeing your pants is cool, consider me Miles Davis.
This new trailer had some wild imagery, including, of course, Leon Kennedy. In this, Leon is seemingly tripping and dealing with some wild visions. We see a screaming moose head and some bladed baby dolls, and a guy with a huge hook and a chain that seems to be chasing Leon. When he catches Leon, Leon turns with a terrified look and we get another date, 2000X, again, suggesting that it would be coming sometime in the 2000s. Dubbed the Hallucination trailer by Capcom and Hookman by fans, it was only ever shown at this E3. Of course, this was indeed spooky, and some might have peed their pants, but things were not going as well at Capcom.
If peeing your pants is cool.
The scenario writer for this hallucination idea was Yasuhisa Kawamura, who had worked on Resident Evil 3 and was inspired by the Lost Souls movie starring Winona Ryder. In that movie, Winona Ryder had to deal with some hallucinations, and I imagine this was an interesting concept for Kawamura.
Once you face evil, true evil, you discover something.
While this trailer, again, was well received by the fans, there was a big issue at Capcom. While Kawamura was trying to make the game literally as scary as possible, it was a bit of a change from previous Resident Evil games, which had focused really on science fiction. And while he was chasing this concept of a foe and issue that is beyond reason and difficult to explain, and while seats were certainly stained with urine, totally not me though, right? There were some technical issues with this idea that would prove extremely difficult and costly to achieve. Because the game was designed to keep players in suspense of when Leon was hallucinating or not, and because there were hidden checkpoints along the way that would trigger this, it would require the creation of both a normal world and a hallucination world. And the limited budget along with the GameCube, for which this was intended, simply would struggle to handle this. And so development practically stopped for Resident Evil 4 yet again, with not much more than the trailer having been realized. The trouble with this is that though Mikami wasn't the director of these games, he had made some promises that were going to be difficult to keep. You might say he was writing checks that his butt couldn't cash. He kept promising a full model change, likely to combat the concerns of fans who felt that Resident Evil had grown dull, and he had promised that it would be the scariest Resident Evil yet. With these two promises out there with the public, the stakes were growing higher and higher. This was the second time in the last 5 years that Resident Evil threatened to fail. Resident Evil 2, despite its incredible quality, had to be changed because it was just not enjoyable. It was not fitting the Resident Evil style at first, but that's a whole different story. but contextually realized that things were just rocky, and this was not their first rodeo. Now with Resident Evil 4, the teams were facing these similar issues again. The design had changed from Devil May Cry to the fog to the hallucination idea, of which fans were clamoring, but the technology and budget couldn't support that vision. And again, they were back to square one. Resident Evil 3 was released in 1999, and time was escaping Capcom as it was already 2003 at this point. A quick Google will tell you that Resident Evil 4 eventually released in January of 2005. So what happened to make this all come together? With Resident Evil's, Capcom's, and Mikami's reputation threatened, Mikami had to do something. In the past, Mikami had allowed project leads to stick around during turbulent times to help guide them into success, as he was a great mentor to so many people. But with so much on the line, he instead had to release Shibata and Kawamura from the project. And get this, he put himself in the director's position. Oh snap, Daddy's home. The man that originally created Resident Evil was back at the helm for Resident Evil 4. Speaking of prolific creators at the helms of eerie games, how's that for a segue? I have another similar video here about how unsettling Mother is. After this video, you might give it a shot. Onward! January 2004 brought the public yet another trailer for Resident Evil 4, and it wasn't anything like the trailers they'd released before. This shocked viewers and would come to redefine Resident Evil as a whole. This trailer didn't have the dark houses and castles of before. It didn't focus on flesh-eating zombies. It showed us daytime and villagers living in a rural area. This also introduced us to the change in view that we got with Resident Evil 4, which was different than the fixed camera angles of before. This allowed people to see more of the screen and the action taking place in front of the character. This was all with the impressive fidelity of widescreen, which wasn't exactly commonplace in video games at the time. Players no longer had to go to their inventory to see health and ammunition. It was displayed in the corner. The game changed from characters who were much more helpless to Leon Kennedy, action star, sent to save the president's daughter from a cult. What a huge change from what survival horror was to this new action. Mikami had certainly created something different with this game. Resident Evil 4 finally released in 2005. Revolutionizing the survival horror genre and earning wide acclaim for its innovative gameplay, intense atmosphere, and cinematic presentation. The game's departure from fixed camera angles to an over-the-shoulder perspective, along with its dynamic aiming system, provided an unprecedented level of immersion and excitement to gamers. Mikami's Resident Evil 4 invigorated the franchise and influenced numerous games, setting a new standard for action-adventure and survival horror titles. Resident Evil 4 was huge. It was an incredible success. At one time before the release, some people were worried that it lost its spooky edge, while others were excited to see a change of pace. The former were sated after playing the game and feeling that chill up their spine that is the fear associated with survival. Think quick, be resourceful, or die. That's about how it goes, and similarly enough, that seems to be the sort of fear that Mikami must have felt after 5 years of development and 4 separate phases. What it must have felt like to have to step out of the manager position and back into the director role to save the franchise he worked so diligently to establish. In trying to help the series carry on, even when hope was dimming and time was fleeting, Mikami recognized the need to survive and acted on it, thinking quickly, being resourceful, and there's not much more that we could have asked or expected from the man that saved Resident Evil 4.